32nd ASEAN Economic Ministers Retreat. Joining us today is Attorney Allan Gepty, DTI Undersecretary for International Trade and Philippines ASEAN Economic Ministers Lead. Once again, joining us today is Attorney Allan Gepty, DTI Undersecretary for International Trade and Philippines ASEAN Economic Ministers Lead. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to join you today to give you updates on the upcoming 32nd ASEAN Economic Ministers Retreat tomorrow. This gathering comes at an unprecedented time where the global economy is facing myriad and complex challenges such as geopolitical tensions, climate risks, supply chain disruptions, technological transformation, and conflict in the Middle East. ASEAN is not spared by the effects of these economic realities. The disruptions brought about by the conflict in the Middle East continue to affect global supply chains and energy markets, reminding us that energy security is closely tied to economic stability and regional resilience. For the upcoming retreat of our economic ministers, they will be discussing not just key priorities of our chairship, but also recent global and regional developments. They will be meeting also with the ASEAN Business and Advisory Council, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, and the ASEAN Development Bank. Given the context of the current economic situation, the theme of our chairship, Navigating Our Future Together, is therefore timely and symbolic. History reminds us that periods of global transition often reward regions that act with coherence and foresight. And when the world becomes more complex, cooperation becomes even more valuable. And today, ASEAN economic ministers came together to ensure that our region continues to move forward with unity, resilience, and stability. After all, in the words of our President, ASEAN is our ship. The ASEAN Economic Ministers Retreat is an important platform and meeting in the ASEAN economic community. It provides ministers with an opportunity to convene in a more informal setting to exchange views and discuss how we can further strengthen regional economic integration. On this note, we will start with an interface with the private sector through the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. With this, we can hear their insights and concerns that need to be addressed at the regional level so that our policy intervention is responsive and aligned with the realities on the ground. In fact, many of the improvements we have made in the region's business environment, from trade facilitation to digitalization and supply chain connectivity, have been shaped by the perspectives and recommendations coming from the business community. We will also have an interface with the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, an international organization and research institution whose main role is to conduct research and policy analysis to facilitate the ASEAN economic community, building by providing research, insightful policy analysis, and evidence-based recommendations to advance economic integration, strengthen regional resilience, and promote sustainable growth across our region. The ministers will also meet Asian Development Bank to discuss how we can strengthen our partnership towards implementation of the ASEAN 2045, our shared future. As a regional development bank with deep institutional knowledge, ADB can act as financing and advisory partner to ASEAN that can provide advisory support, dedicated financing on key initiatives, and technical assistance needed aligned with ASEAN's strategic priorities. This partnership is particularly timely as 2026 marks the first year of implementing ASEAN 2045 and coincides with the Philippines ASEAN Chairship, allowing us to begin shaping the trajectory of its implementation together with our partners. On the retreat proper, the Philippines' participation, both as AEM Chair and AEM Philippine Lead, provides a good opportunity to reaffirm our steadfast commitment to advancing a more resilient, innovative, dynamic, and people-centered ASEAN. This provides the Philippines a strategic opportunity to shape the regional economic agenda and demonstrate leadership with ASEAN. It also helps set priorities, advance initiatives aligned with national interests, and enhances the country's visibility and influence in discussions with ASEAN's dialogue and development partners that creating opportunities to strengthen trade, investment, and economic cooperation. Among the key areas to be discussed during the retreat are the Philippine Priority Economic Deliverables, or PEDs. The Philippines sees the endorsement of the PEDs as the highlight of the retreat. The PEDs cover a diverse range of areas of trade such as energy, agriculture, strategic trade management, MSMEs, and artificial intelligence, and ASEAN's efforts to advance the sustainable and green agenda. Just to highlight some PEDs, ASEAN recognizes importance of balancing economic growth with environmental responsibility. One key PED on this area is the Greener Future implementation of the Regional Investment Promotion Action Plan 2025-2030. This will help position ASEAN as a single investment destination for sustainable investment while accelerating the region's green transition and inclusive economic growth. This is well aligned with the country's positioning to become a prime destination for foreign investments, especially in climate change and environmental, social, and governance initiatives in the region. Another crucial deliverable is the DEFA, or the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement. The DEFA is envisioned as the most comprehensive regional agreement in ASEAN, covering the digital economy and e-commerce. It aims to create a digital environment that is open, secure, interoperable, competitive, and inclusive. Banking on the strength of the region on semiconductors and electronics, we will have a PED entitled ASEAN Semiconductor Roadmap, enabling pathways for strategic investment. Among others, it will help establish ASEAN as a globally competitive hub for semiconductor investment, position its AMS to participate effectively in the supply chain, strengthen value chain integration, and regional complementarities in design, fabrication, testing, and packaging, and advanced workforce development. We will also have a PED on the establishment of the ASEAN Center of Excellence for Creative Industries, which will serve as a regional coordination and convergence platform for cultural and creative industries development initiative. It will be designed to advance ASEAN creative industries and foster inclusive innovation-driven growth throughout the region. This will be complemented by the IP Evaluation Manual for ASEAN. Of course, being the champion of MSME integration in the global value chain, we will also have a PED on the establishment of the ASEAN Center of Excellence for Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprises. As energy security is regional security, one PED we have is advancing ASEAN energy interconnectivity through the operationalization of the enhanced Memorandum of Understanding on ASEAN Power Grid. This PED will not only help address pressing energy security challenges, but also drive ASEAN closer to its vision of having a fully interconnected, modernized, and sustainable energy landscape. Indeed, we must work together to maintain stability in the region's energy supply by strengthening cooperation across our energy networks, improving connectivity across supply chains, and ensuring the continued openness of maritime routes that are vital to global trade and energy flows. Another deliverable that we deem important in the current global landscape is the deliverable on Leaders' Declaration on Strategic Trade Management for Secure Regional Trade. This declaration will pave the way for all ASEAN member states to adopt and implement laws and regulations to regulate trade involving sensitive goods and technologies that can be used for commercial purposes and weapons such as biological weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Strategic trade management will ensure that these goods will not fall into the wrong hands. A robust strategic trade management increases the trust of foreign investors and companies, secure access to strategic technologies, and protection of high-value sectors of the country. This retreat involves substantive and important discussions that are timely and urgent given recent developments. ASEAN remains central on this development and plays a vital role in shaping the global economy. Thus, showing our united resolve as we navigate our future is a strength in itself. Once again, thank our colleagues from the media for your continued interest in ASEAN's economic cooperation and for helping communicate these developments to the public. Maraming salamat po, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, sir. We will now move forward to our question and answer session. Our first question will come from... Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Yusek. Mikael of Reuters. Sir, what kind of response are the economic ministers looking at tomorrow, particularly on the Middle East crisis and its impact on oil prices in the region? Because practically majority of the ASEAN member states are net oil importers. And second, U.S. President Trump has doubled down on his trade war with him invoking Section 301, and some ASEAN member states were specifically mentioned in that invocation. So, on those two fronts, what kind of responses are the ministers looking at? Yeah.
Well, thank you for that very important question. Well, as to the responses of ASEAN member states on the recent developments, particularly on the conflict in the Middle East, one thing that maybe we have to bear in mind is that ASEAN's core principle is the ASEAN centrality. And so therefore, it is important that we have to work together to ensure that the regional economic integration agenda that we have embraced remains intact. And having said that, we have to prioritize certain sectors, such as, for example, energy security, food security, and ensuring the supply chain is also intact. And on this premise, it is important that our actions, responses to the ongoing conflicts must be synchronized so that we will be working together as we address these challenges, because we cannot afford to have a separate approach in addressing this conflict. It is a must that ASEAN member states must work together. On the question of the ongoing 301 investigation launched by the USTR, of course, we take note that the same is part of the process that they have invoked under the Trade Regulation Act of 1974. So on the part of the Philippines and, of course, the rest of ASEAN will have to closely monitor this investigation. And, of course, we hope that this will be consistent also with the international trade rules.
Thank you, sir. Next question.
Hi, sir. Good afternoon. Ramon from Nikkei. Sir, I'm just curious, when you were talking about ASEAN centrality on the approach to the region's approach, basically on the Middle East crisis, can you, I guess, be more specific on maybe will they propose more policy interventions to address that? Because I think energy security is such a big issue right now for the region, and many countries, especially ASEAN, is finding ways to address these price pressures. Thank you.
Well, when we speak of ASEAN centrality, it is important that all actions, measures, and policy intervention that each ASEAN member state will adopt and implement must be consistent with the regional economic integration. And that simply means that our market in ASEAN must remain open for trade and investment. Now, you will note that whenever there are conflicts, for example, or international emergencies, the usual approach of some economies or members, for example, is of course to ensure that their food supply, energy supply will be enough to meet their local or domestic demands. There were instances also in the past that sometimes certain non-tariff measures will be adopted and implemented, which to some extent may serve as non-tariff barriers. So in other words, by working together, it is important that any and all policy measures that we will adopt and implement must be consistent with regional economic integration agenda and therefore must avoid measures that will be considered or will resort to non-tariff barriers or will resort to trade barriers in the process. So I hope that clarifies your question.
Hi, sir. Claire Yao from Bloomberg. Just to follow up on that one, some Southeast Asian countries are considering to halt exports of crude, prioritizing domestic refineries. Does that mean ASEAN will urge them to not pursue those measures and instead keep a free flow of trade, especially of petroleum products?
So that's a good follow-up question. Because usually, as I mentioned, when I say non-tariff barriers, of course, one good example would be export restriction. Of course, in ASEAN, and even under WTO, we have embraced to keep our markets open for trade and investment. And as much as possible, we have to refrain from adopting and implementing measures that will restrict trade in the process. So that's one, of course, scenario that we will try to avoid. Because as mentioned, we have to make sure that the supply chain, particularly on energy, food, and other vital sectors must remain intact. So we will avoid any disruption in the process. So we need to help each other to address this current problem.
Thank you, sir. Next question.
Another follow-up on that question. Sir, among the ASEAN economies, which countries, or probably you can talk about the Philippines, what sectors is the Philippines vulnerable in this situation? Like if we face certain embargoes from co-ASEAN economies, what sectors will be affected aside from oil?
Well, immediately comes to mind would be the energy sector. Because if you take into account our energy sector in the Philippines, when it comes to, let's say, dependency on crude oil, the bulk of our crude oil comes from the Middle East. Also, when it comes to power generation, majority of the power generated are also from coal power plant. And you know the effect. If there will be some challenges on the price and also on the supply of crude oil, in the process, the price also of coal will be affected. So there will be a chain reaction. So in other words, the challenge is not just on the price, but also on the supply of both energy from fuel, crude oil, and coal in the process.
What about other commodities, probably rice?
Well, on rice, of course, in terms of price, that will be affected because, as I mentioned, since energy is a vital component in all the supply chain, so it will really result to, let's say, domino effect. So we'll have to be vigilant also in monitoring the prices on not just rice, but also prime commodities.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions?
Collaboration on like grains trade and
Sorry.
or would you know if the bloc is also considering collaborations or deals on, say, cooperation on grains trade to secure food supply? Parang
Well, in ASEAN, we do have an arrangement that when it comes to emergency situation, we have to really work together. In fact, one arrangement that I recall would be when it comes to our rice demands. So we have some arrangement in ASEAN on that. We are also working on energy cooperation. That's why one of the PEDs of the Philippines in this chairship is the implementation of the MOU on ASEAN Power Grid. So there are many ways by which ASEAN member states cooperate to ensure that, of course, the supply chain remains intact and resilient in times of emergency.
Sir, for this summit, will there will there be a move to further, say, follow up on the arrangements? Or maybe parang i-increase pa yung collaboration to other commodities?
Well, I do not want to preempt the outcome of the retreat tomorrow. But if there is one thing that I would like to highlight is the fact that definitely our economic ministers will have to discuss and come up with some ways forward how ASEAN can work together to address the present situation. And if there is one arrangement that I expect is definitely a commitment from each ASEAN member state to keep its others' economy or market open for trade and investment, and that each ASEAN member state must avoid or refrain from adopting and implementing restrictive measures to trade, because it's very important that the supply chain again in ASEAN must be preserved.
Thank you, sir. Next question. Yes, sir.
Sir, the ASEAN foreign ministers will also be meeting tomorrow in a special meeting to discuss the Middle East crisis. So I was wondering if there's any coordination between the economic ministers as well as the foreign ministers, and what sort of joint response or overlapping response that you may be envisioning, particularly on the Middle East crisis. Thank you.
Well, definitely, there is a coordination with foreign ministers. In fact, in ASEAN, there are 3 pillars. So all these pillars are coordinating with each other when it comes to our respective responses.
Thank you, sir. Next question. No more questions.
Critical. Okay. Well, on critical minerals, actually, we have a PED on critical minerals. And the intention of that PED is for ASEAN to have a universal understanding as to the list of critical minerals that we refer to at the regional level whenever we promote and facilitate investments. Well, they have to deliberate on that because there are so many critical minerals. So at least for purposes of ASEAN, so whenever we promote investments, for example, or facilitate investment on critical minerals or utilization of critical minerals, it's important that at least we have a common understanding. What are these critical minerals? And that will be one of the outcome of this PED. They will have to discuss. So there's a specific working group that will handle the same.
Thank you, sir. Last question.
Do we have investments already? Like, are there interested parties or companies who are willing to invest for critical minerals processing here in the Philippines?
Well, number one, the Philippines has huge reserves of critical minerals, particularly nickel, copper, and cobalt, among others. And it has been the trust of our Board of Investment to promote investments on the exploration and also processing of these critical minerals. Actually, the focus is more on not just exploration, but also processing, because we want to generate high value from these natural reserves that you have. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Hi, sir. Will ASEAN's economic ministers come out with, I guess, a unified stand on the U.S. tariffs? I guess following the retreat, will the ministers, like a united position or something?
Well, we only came to know of the news on the investigation initiated by USTR. So as mentioned earlier, we take note of that process as part of their domestic law. So we will closely monitor the same, and we hope that the same will be consistent also with international trade rules.
Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you. Do you have a closing statement, sir?
Well, as a closing statement, maybe what I would like to highlight is that in ASEAN, which is our ship according to our president, it's very important that whenever we adopt and implement measures, we have to keep in mind that we have to make sure that our regional economic integration agenda is intact and anchored on security, sustainability, and shared prosperity. And on our part, I think it is also important that personally, we take that as a goal also, that in our every work, endeavor, or action, we have to keep in mind also the aspect of advancing sustainability agenda, being mindful of security, and also shared prosperity. And that means we have to be a key driver also of inclusive growth so that no one is left behind.
Thank you so much, sir. That ends our press briefing. For more information, please visit our website, asean2026.gov.ph, and other social media platforms. Thank you.
Thank you.